Hello there, good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming to the Mind Is The Frontline at Army at the Fringe. My name's Rosie Kay, and I'm the curator and host of the events today, and there's 4 talks tomorrow as well. I have a kind of 12-year or so history with working with the Army. I embedded with an infantry battalion way back in 2008, where I shadowed 4 rifles when they were just back from Iraq, pre-deployment to Afghanistan, and just saw what it was like to train and prepare the body for war. I also spent time at Headley Court and Selly Oak, and I saw the sort of repercussions of some of the injuries of warfare and how soldiers were surviving and being rehabilitated. And that led to me creating a work in 2010 called 5 Soldiers. So Army at the Fringe and 5 Soldiers have quite a history together. We were part of the first Army at the Fringe in 2017, and we performed the show here to a sellout audience. So working with the Army has been quite a long-term sort of project, I suppose, for me. And when Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Mackenzie sort of spoke to me and said, shall we think about doing some kind of arts and military symposium as part of this year's post-pandemic event, I said that I felt that perhaps I was more interested in looking at what's going on in the future. I'd been watching things online. Obviously, we're all aware of the sort of crisis that's been caused by the pandemic, as well as certain climate change crisis. And I wanted to look at the possible future of conflict, what that meant for the body and for the mind. I wanted to look at society. What kind of say do we have about what society we want to live in the future, and how does that relate to conflict? And I wanted to say something about the position of the arts. I think during the pandemic, I personally have felt that the arts have sort of been relegated to somewhere around entertainment level to kind of calm us and soothe us, because I feel quite strongly that the arts are here to challenge and to investigate and to look at new truths and distinguish what is the truth and what are untruths. And so I wanted to pull together experts from across different fields, from the arts, from academia, and from the military, to talk about some of this subject matter. I'm really excited about today's guests. They all have something really incredible to say, and the focus of today's talk is the body. So in 2010, when it was 5 Soldiers, the body is the front line, where I felt that across millennia, the place of warfare has always been the human body, whether it be the Greek wars or World War I or Afghanistan. The place of all warfare is the harming and maiming and killing of human bodies. Perhaps now we were entering a new realm where disinformation, fake information, sort of information weaponry was being used across all societies. And perhaps now the mind is the new front line. At the same time, there are new technologies that are disrupting our sense of reality with social media, with AI technologies, with AR and VR technologies, that are making us look at our relationship with reality and our relationship with ourselves in very different ways. So I've always felt that the body was a soldier's medium of their job, but perhaps that's changing, and it's changing quicker than general population realise. Are we at the forefront of a blend of body and technologies, or does soft flesh still meet hard metal? And where does the body end and the robot, or perhaps the hybrid body, begin? So I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers, and then I'm going to ask them to tell us a little bit more about who they are. First we have author and artist Harry Parker. We've known each other way back from 2008, when Harry was an officer in 4 Rifles. And we've stayed in touch, and Harry's author of an incredible book, Anatomy of a Soldier, which if you've not read, you must, and is also currently working on a new book, The Hybrid Body, which is also brilliant. I have Rob Taylor here, also in real life, I should point out, from 4GD, which is a technology company that looks at the training of soldier and probably for the first time really uses biometric data to see what actually happens. As far as I understand, a lot of soldiering's gone on with kind of ideas about what should and shouldn't happen, but there's no particular proof or data-driven to tell us what does happen. And you're having some quite interesting and unexpected results. And then my third guest today is from the US and is a choreographer called Sydney Sky Better. And he works in the most incredible realm of both choreography. You're a very respected choreographer in his own right, with works at the Joyce Theatre and the Lincoln Centre, but also looks... Oh, sorry, something just fell off your TV, Sydney. Also works in the realm of surveillance, drone and satellite data, and how our movements across the globe can set off military alarms to see if you might be doing funny things or not, as far as I understand. Sydney will explain a lot better than me. So I'm going to hand it over to them, but just to say, I'm not necessarily an expert about any of this myself, but I'm really interested and fascinated in the subject matter. I will have some time for questions at the end, so please kind of build them up. There's no question too silly, too stupid, more of a notion than a question, so please kind of store those up for the end of the talk. I am going to still try and end on time at 3:15, so that gives us just under an hour to talk to each other. Lovely. So can I start with Harry to give an introduction? Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie, and thanks. Hi, everyone. I just thought Rosie said no more than 5 minutes, so I'll try and keep it brief, but I did actually make notes on the train. So I just thought I'd say sort of three things, really. My first thing I wanted to talk about was how we sort of prepare the body for war. And I was thinking about it, and I just thought about that moment where, as a soldier, you go from the relative safety of a patrol base or a camp, and you step out into enemy territory for a patrol. And it's sort of quite sort of evocative scene, and I'm sure anyone who's watched a war film will sort of can see that line of soldiers are all in their kit. But as someone who's been there, it always struck me that, firstly, we were always late, and the reasons we were always late was to do with technology. The radios were bust, we couldn't hear each other, or something about a drone or some part of our systems wasn't working well. The second thing was that even though everyone was sort of covered in their kit, their helmet, their body armour, I could always tell who they were by the way they moved, or their gait, or their sort of stoop, and the fact that they were all having the last final cigarette before they sort of went through that gate. And for me, putting on those layers of equipment was sort of, in a way, it turned me into a soldier, because it made me feel like a soldier. There was something about putting on the heavy body armour and the helmet which made me remember my training. Without it, I would never have gone out the gate. You know, that's what gave me the confidence. And I think there's something sort of performative in that. You know, you're sort of acting out being brave. And for a soldier, that for me, that's often how it felt. The last thing to say on that is just that, you know, we're a tool using the species. You know, we can pick up a hammer and hit a nail almost without thinking about it. And as a soldier, you become very sort of embodied with your weaponry and your kit. So anyone who's sort of been on tour will know that you sort of end up with a little sort of callus on top of your thumb where you've been carrying your weapon. And to have that sort of connection to a weapon, where you're so comfortable with it, it's quite a weird experience. And so in a sense, maybe we do turn the body into a tool, into a weapon. And then when you step through the gate, the other thing that I noticed was that there's something quite interesting about what happens, especially in the wars that I fought. You know, we were carrying sort of 50 kilograms each. We had wagons rolling out behind us of armoured vehicles. We had drones in the sky. We were a system of systems. And the enemy, when they got tooled up, you know, they picked up an AK-47 and put on a pair of trainers. So there was something about the inequality of it. And we all sort of have a sense of what digital poverty might be. That people who don't have laptops and things, they can't access services. But in warfare, it was quite interesting that. And when I look at my prosthetics, this from here to here, this piece of kit here is worth about £50,000 for a microprocessor. It's got a little brain in it, which might be AI, might not be, depending on how you sort of classify AI. But I'm very lucky to have this, and other people who go into the NHS don't get this. It's only having been a soldier that I sort of get it. And the last thing to say on the sort of inequality is that you know, I got really pissed off somehow. It really made me angry when I came home and I saw headlines that said sort of the cowardly Taliban using IEDs, and I just thought it was a real misunderstanding of how warfare works. You know, we were using drones that dropped, you know, warheads from 10,000 meters, 10,000 feet, and straight onto compounds and destroyed them. And to me, that was no different. Nothing was cowardly or otherwise in warfare, and it slightly, to me, seemed like a slight misunderstanding of the way warfare works. And the last thing is just about the costs of technology. You know, Rosie mentioned you know, what might the future be in terms of augmentation or the hybrid human in warfare. And all I can say about sort of my legs is when people see me walking, they say, "Oh, that's cool, that must be great, you know, can you run, can you jump?" But what they can't see is the fact that it's bloody painful, it's sweaty, it's hot, it rubs, it's having an impact on my musculoskeletal, you know, it's sort of wearing down my hip, and there's a real cost to the technologies I use. And I think, you know, when you look at some of the modern technology, for instance, an exoskeleton, which is a robotic sort of assisted exoskeleton, and there's some exoskeletons being developed for soldiers. To me, I look at them and I just think, okay, they might be fine for one job, but I'd hate to wear one in a battlefield just in case it broke or the batteries ran out. And when you look at like the analogy I can give is if you look at someone like it's a bad example, but Oscar Pistorius, when he runs down the track, he potentially is faster than anyone else. But if you watched him trying to make a cup of tea on his prosthetics, he would fall over because they're so unbalanced. So they're phenomenally good at one job, and we can do that with technology. But in a sort of fluid, chaotic experience like war, potentially these sorts of augmentations are further away than we think. So yeah, and the last thing I just close on is just to say, just as Rosie's point about, you know, is it the mind? And I think it definitely is. But in warfare, it always felt to me that there was sort of visceral nature about warfare, where you were trying to defeat the enemy, and to do that, it was all about people and sadly about humanity and defeating humanity. So I think in the end, no matter what technologies we use and how we try and sort of impact people's minds, in the end, it'll be about sadly about sort of defeating people's will through causing injury. Sorry, was that more?
That was brilliant. No, I wasn't not timing you. It's not a stopwatch. Right? It's right. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And there's some of that stuff we definitely will come back to discuss a little bit more as well. I think it'd be nice to go to you, Sydney, online. Yes, yeah, and then we can come back to real life Rob.
Great. Well, first, just to check our systems, can everybody hear me okay?
Could you do it being a little bit louder?
You want me to be a little louder?
No,
I can do that.
I think they're going to put the volume up.
They're going to be louder. This is going to be great. So first, Rosie and Jordan and the entire production team, I just want to thank you all so much for not only inviting me to be a part of today's proceedings, but also producing these sorts of hybrid events is really its own trench, as it were. So I just want to thank you so much. Can we, this is maybe pandering, but can we give a round of applause to the organizers of this event? Can we, yeah, put your hands together. Beaming nerds from across the ocean is not easy. So anyway, thank you so much, team. And I really look forward to being in conversation with you all and to learning from you. So my name is Sydney Skybetter. Indeed, I'm a professor of choreography and emerging technologies here at Brown University. So I'm the founder of the Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces, and my particular research interests are pattern of life surveillance and choreo robotics, which is the art of how robotic movements make meaning. Now, probably the most famous example of this sort of dance technology hybrid is the company Boston Dynamics, which has produced a number of viral videos on YouTube featuring its bipedal and quadrupedal robots doing things like the mashed potato or dancing with the boy band BTS, as you do. Boston Dynamics is a policing and military contractor. They have invested millions and millions of dollars into the functionality to make its robots dance. And from the standpoint of a choreographer, I want to understand how that works and why. Why is this military contractor investing so many millions of dollars in choreography? It turns out that this hybrid of military technology, emerging military technologies, and what we understand as dance has a really long and super weird history. The art that we now call ballet was an adjunct of the French martial fencing and equestrian tradition. And the art form was effectively turned into a colonial weapon by Louis XIV. All of the ballet positions of the arms, all of these things, these correlate to classical fencing technique. All you just need to do is like add a stabbing weapon, and if you know ballet, you can probably stab someone. It's the same principle. Napoleon took his ballet dancers to Africa with him. Dame Margot Fontaine, the great British ballerina, was involved in an armed coup in Panama. Choreographers ranging from Ted Shawn to Alwyn Nicolai have been involved in military performance and intelligence. Dance and the military go way back. And this tradition also carries forward. There are choreographers consulting today with the American Pentagon, the dance notation system and technology called Laban notation, which was founded by a choreographer who admittedly dallied in Nazism. His disciples later consulted on movement efficiency for the American Department of Defense and is actively used in military robotics research. Dance and defense is an active symbiotic relationship. Now, as a researcher, I'm trying to understand how this works, and I'm looking for ways to learn and collaborate in this arena. But in the meantime, just this fall at Brown, we will be welcoming 3 Boston Dynamics Spot quadrupedal robots to campus. And pre-installed within each of these robots is a code base called choreography, which is dance software made for military robots. And in my spring course on choreo robotics, our class is going to end with a dance show choreographed by my students featuring $250,000 of DoD-funded robotics technology. Because I believe, as many of my colleagues do, that dance and choreography are some of the best ways to stress test emerging technologies. Now, this was the case when the technology in question was horses and swords, and it's still the case now with AI, machine vision, and robots. Anyway, so thank you again, Rosie, for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wow, okay, amazing. Yeah, I'm going to come back to this relationship between the dance learning and the military learning, and because it says something about bodies learning, and it says something about groups of bodies learning. But before we get there, Rob, it would be lovely to hear some more from you.
That's right, yeah, and thanks, and hi. So my name's Rob Taylor, and sort of actually I was listening to Harry Sydney. What's really interesting is there's sort of 2 dynamics to this. There's the how can technology help sort of in a military environment, how can we perform better or potentially perform in a different way? Where I've sort of come from is sort of the opposite, but it's the start of the journey that sort of ends to the same sort of end stage, is how can we use technology to understand what the body's doing better, and how can we sort of use that to attack some of the assumptions that have been made today on how we operate, how the human body works, and what sort of soldiers are doing as they go through both training and then onto operations. So, when we started in the company about 5 years ago, our intention was to sort of improve training, and that's sort of what we've done over the last 3 years. But what we sort of drifted now into, which was entirely accidental as much as I try and persuade people it wasn't, is we sort of realised that the military, the way they train is that they have doctrine, and the doctrine then informs how the training works. But what we were finding is a lot of the doctrine is sort of based in apocryphal tales, experience, but that allows stuff like survivorship bias to start to creep in, and you start to end up looking at how training is adapting to the current operational sort of environment, but it's not being allowed to be sort of tested and sort of assessed as to whether or not it's a good change, a bad change, or an indifferent change. And so what we then have moved into is by creating sort of better infrastructure, we're able to start to now look at how the body operates. So what we're sort of, and how we, and one of the things I think, also the angle I'll be coming at this from is, what do we know about the body? What stresses are being put on soldiers as they go sort of, exactly like how you described that, onto the ground? Are they as stressed as we think they are? Are they more stressed than we think they are? And if then so, what can we do about that? So I think one of the things we've been looking at of late is sort of how do we start to look at, so effectively under the skin, so biometrics, be that respiratory rate, heart rate, how do we start to look at things like pupil dilation, stress through what the eyes are doing? And then does that correlate with certain activities? And then if so, what can then that enable in the future? Because I think a lot of the technologies that I think we'll be talking about later, sort of robotics, virtual and sort of simulation type activities, they all need a decent data set to go into. I think the one mistake, to speak frankly, that defence as a sort of group is doing is they love to charge to the big shiny bit of kit at the end of it, because it's the sexy bit of equipment that costs a load of money and looks like it's going to may change, but if the assumptions on which that technology is sort of being procured on are unsound, it's not really going to work. So I think what we need to do, especially around robotics, is really interesting thing what Sydney was talking about with dance, is how can we test and sort of assess those technologies in a way that's potentially a bit different. It's sort of one of the things I was really excited about this talk about. And the second one is then, I think we'll move on to later, but the US Army are now looking at putting augmented reality headsets onto their soldiers and starting to pour a load of data into those soldiers. My query to defence, and one of the things we'll actually talk about, is where is that data coming from? Because it's all well and good having a sort of $5,000 headset, but if the data pouring in is the same data that we've been using today, the performance isn't going to improve. And I think there's one thing that we've always had as a rule in the office is technology cannot or should not even be considered if it reduces the performance without the technology. If you stick a headset on a soldier and their ability to see or look down the scope of their weapon is reduced, it doesn't matter if there's a load of unforeseen benefits, it should be immediately discounted. So I think one of the things I'm really interested in as this sort of conversation goes is to look at how we can assess, how can we use technology to assess the success of technology as we move forward.
Yeah, and I suppose it sort of goes back to Harry's earlier point about despite all the kit and all the technology and everything else, you knew exactly who each other was, and because humans understand humans better than anything, actually. Let's go back a wee bit earlier, and I'd just like to talk a little bit that the lights just changed dramatically there. And I'm not going to do a dance about this, honestly, I'm all right. Let's talk about that training of the body, because one of my arguments, I think with Gordon a long time ago, was that the army suffer from a similar sort of problem that the dance world does, which is that it basically becomes a survival of the fittest. And that's talking about like basic training. So your dance school, you go through, and it isn't necessarily the best brains, the most creative, or the most artistic. It's if you sprain your ankle more than 4 times, that's it. Your career is basically over. And you'll sprain your ankle because you're doing way too much on your legs, you haven't got your calf sorted out, you haven't got your core and alignment sorted out yet, and you're being pushed too far too soon. Now, I know a little bit, having sort of trained with 4 rifles, when you add weight, huge amounts of weight to that, you're then increasing that risk of injury enormously. There's so much talk and thought, and deep thought that goes into leadership in the army, and there is now much better physical training, but it does seem to still rely on the survival of the fittest thing, that some of the best brains will get lost by that accident, by that thing that happens, and you weren't expecting it. The other side of that is that discipline, that daily, for me, what becomes ritual, that you not only have to not think about it, but through repeating certain movements, they become part of your soul. So you engage your body in such a deep way, it goes beyond learning, it goes beyond unthinking learning, and it starts to become who you are. And I think something similar happens with soldiering and repetition. And I wondered if you could just talk about that, memories of your body, of training, of the repetition, and I'd love to talk about drill a little bit too.
We've got the 2 worst soldiers. Drill. Yeah, sorry.
No,
Go for it, Harry. Yeah.
So when you were talking there, I think for me, I hope this isn't off point, but there was this real sort of strange tension between, I think sometimes what people think the army is like, which is very inhuman. Sort of everyone is a sort of tool of war. We're all sort of broken down until we're all the same, and that wasn't my experience in the military. Actually, it was a very human place, and actually some of the most human experiences I've ever had have been on operations. But at the same time, there's this tension with the training, and we've got to be quite frank that when you train a soldier, you have to put them through some, as you say, some pretty tough experiences, and in a sense, and I hate using the word because to say that a soldier is brainwashed, we sort of use brainwashing when we talk about the enemy, but we're going through Catterick or Sandhurst or something is a form of brainwashing. People will hate me saying that, but there is, it's a type of training, and I think we should be frank about that. And I think, even when I was in the military, it's not even that long ago, but probably is quite long ago, I think we were getting better at using things like technology and understanding how to keep soldiers in the game and look after them, both psychologically and physically. And I think with, we can get on things like soft robotics and things like that, where actually you could support the soldier in ways to carry more weight, more ammunition. So I think that there is a role for technology, especially probably with the sorts of technology that Rob develops, perhaps.
I think there's sort of three aspects as you were talking about. I think one is, to start off, I think the one thing that the military, as training's developed, there's obviously been, it was founded sort of in a war, you mentioned the wartime where there was a necessity to get soldiers at speed out to the front line. And I think where there's potential grounds to develop that is, I think there's a lot of talent lost in training because there is a natural assumption that, you go sports like rowing where there's an archetypal body that makes a good rower, whereas I think the assumption that that is the same in the military is a pretty weak one. But yet, if you were to go into a sort of a training course, the people that are passing probably all do look, sound, and similar. It's not necessarily a fault of the military, it's a fault of the ability to actually assess what's actually going on. I think that's a great example of a lot of assessment in a sort of urban environment is from a top-down view where you can just see the top of a helmet. Now there's an assessment that a soldier is doing a good job, is they're moving the right way or doing the right things. But what's going on under that helmet is a completely different picture. And I think knowing what is going on, you might find that there is individuals that potentially don't look or sound like one expects them to do, that is probably going to be the better performers. The second point you raised was weight, and I think it's a fascinating aspect that the military's answer to safety is to make their soldiers heavier, which therefore sort of exacerbates the previous problem. And my view is always, there's a great, and it's a very difficult bit of assessment to do, which is something we're trying to achieve, is the soldier better suited having a massive body armour plate on them, which stops the bullet when it arrives, or is it better for that soldier to not be there when the bullet arrives at that point? And my argument clearly would be the latter is better. But effectively, that does take some guts because it would mean reducing the weight on soldiers to test that thesis, which is clearly going to be quite a dangerous thing to prove. And the final point on drill, sorry to go on the third aspect is, I think about this last night, is I think what drill does is the ability to react rapidly to a command, and I was trying to think about it on a sort of a left to right time sort of perspective. If there is not enough time to make a decision, getting people to react immediately is exactly what you want them to do. You don't want to have a debate on whether you should go left or right when there's 1 second to make a decision. But what does happen is that sort of lack of dynamism and lack of flexibility then creeps into decisions that you have days potentially to make, but we must do it this way because it's the way that we've always done it. And I think sort of allowing a sort of growing dynamism, the more time there is from a left to right perspective, could be quite a useful sort of way to approach subject.
Brilliant. And Sydney, with your perspective as a dancer and choreographer as well.
Yeah, no, I'm struck by your use of the words react, dynamism. These are especially when we're juxtaposing these with the disciplining required in training. What we're talking about is the relationship between the ability to follow a command, as you say, but also potentially to improvise. And so, again, I'm reminded that, the balletic tradition, the Western dance tradition originates in French martial training, right? And so these dance techniques were not at all about improvisation or expression or making individual or individuated decisions. They were entirely about following commands. And so I could be mistaken, but I think we have several centuries of legacy code that in training that suggests that following orders, that the physical discipline required to follow those orders and quickly is indeed good, or the best, most effective way to train or be trained. But here I'm inspired by the work of another speaker, I believe, in this series, Roman Baca, among many others, who are returning to military training, returning to military environments with their dancerly knowledge, with their choreographic knowledge, and looking for ways within basic training to instill dancerly or improvisational acumen. So again, I'm really interested and inspired by this tension that you broach between like having more armor or being able to move quicker. And I think people like Roman are inserting themselves and their dance training right into that tension.
I always felt that after my experience of sort of working with the army was that actually I'm probably more able to give orders in the dance world and people to obey me than actually in a military environment where things tend to get discussed actually if there is time. I wanted to look a little bit at preparation. You mentioned it in your opening, Harry, like the preparation to succeed or to win, but then also how do you prepare when things go wrong? And you know, there's an idea in medicine now that you practice twice, but you only do it once. So in surgery, they're doing a lot of stuff now in VR, and they're practicing things multiple times before you only cut once. So they only actually enter the body one time. And it seems like what you're doing is a little bit. How does it work? How do you do it with the VR? Is it like a computer game? You know, that's what we've all got in our heads. Like, what's that actually happen?
Well, I think we're trying to. Interestingly, I think we might discuss it more later. Is we've been looking at VR for quite some time, and we've actually sort of gone from left to right, and then all the way back to the left again. Virtual reality offers a great opportunity, but in certain aspects, I think, you know, if you throw things like virtual reality at the entire spectrum of defence training, a lot of it will get worse rather than get better. Whereas a lot of it's well targeted. It sort of it improves things. So I'll sort of answer the original and then come back to the simulation around sort of preparation to doing things twice. I think the military are getting better at the whole aspect of fail. I know it's part of the recent recruitment strategy about sort of safe to fail and all that sort of stuff. I think though, there's a talk recently when someone was talking about safe to fail, and then plus a slide up of the last 3 exercises a load of battalions have done, and all of them are green. And you sort of think it's rhetoric and reality are very different things. And I think having organisations that are happy for that to be completely red, everything would be, you know, everyone has failed everything, but assume as a result that the performance will increase over time is, I think, quite an interesting, and that's sort of where you get into an organisation that can actually improve. Because true failure, I think, is different to sort of simulated failure. You have a lot of sort of exercises we've been on recently where a little bit, enough is allowed to fail to make it look like we're failing, but actually the entire thing hasn't collapsed. You know, that many people running around with some hair on fire going, what's actually going on here? Which is sort of where you want to get to then come back. So to answer your question about virtual reality, what we've tried to do is push it into areas that are either too dangerous, too difficult, too expensive, rather than across the whole spectrum. So things actually, which I imagine we'll talk about later, like drone footage or drone feeds, creating pattern of life videos. You know, unless you have tens of thousands of actors playing civilians operating in a city, simulate that. Don't simulate something as simple as picking up a rifle that was talked about earlier and then sort of running across the field. That's a very low cost, low complexity activity. So trying to persuade defence to focus on the former, not the latter. So I'm aware that's a little bit of a sort of two-way answer, so I apologise.
It's a sort of example from medicine, but there's some research done that sometimes surgeons who spend too long in VR sort of or there's a chance they carry cavalier approaches into real life. And I think with the military, just as you said, Rob, you've got to be careful about how you simulate these things, but also the real life training that I did. I think sometimes you can carry those cavalier approaches into what you do because, you know, none of the blanks are real, or if you're using lasers, it's just a complete pain in the arse when someone comes up to you and says you're dead, or your thing flashes and says, oh, you've been shot in the head. All you have to go and do is have a brew. But I think that so I think it's really interesting as you say, the balance between how we use these tools to make us more effective.
And Sydney, you're right. Tomorrow morning at 10, Roman Bakker, who's a choreographer and former Marine, is going to be doing some talks around theatres of war, including training medics to go on the front line with special forces and what that entails. So let's go a little bit into this kind of drone or satellite technologies, because I don't know enough to understand how it's being used, and I want to understand more, and I want to understand the implications for us as civilians. Can anyone help me? Is that a Sydney question?
Sure, I'm happy to take a first stab. So again, I'm thinking of these technologies from the standpoint of a choreographer, somebody who is specifically attuned to how bodies moving through space creates meanings of various sorts. And now, relying on, declassified documents or the Snowden leaks, we actually know a lot about how civilian movements can be interpreted by military systems and surveillance satellites, drones, and the like. So, I mean, in theaters of war, some of the kinds of gestures which a computational system would find alarming or flag for a human operator to review include, for example, a sudden U-turn. If you're in a car and you make a U-turn that is too fast, then that will be flagged as a suspicious activity that will then be reviewed by a human monitor. If you follow too close to another car and then disengage but then re-engage, that kind of movement across time will get your movements flagged by an operator. I'll just say that there are dozens and dozens of these kinds of gestures where if you as a civilian are moving through space in a particular surveilled area, your actions may inadvertently cause you to be flagged as a potential threat. Now, there's a lot of layers of interpretation there. So just because you are flagged in a particular way doesn't mean that you as a civilian are necessarily put on a watch list. But what's also become clear is that these kinds of surveilling technologies, both domestically and internationally, in and outside theaters of war, are indeed, like the data created by these systems, not only are putting people on watch lists, but we've got lots of documentation that, again, the American DoD uses this, or Department of Defense uses this data to kill people. It's this data, in part, that informs decisions pertaining to, for example, drone strikes. So this kind of eye in the sky, God's eye surveillance, it's not the only operative data point when it comes to making decisions about particular kinds of military engagements. But this is absolutely one of the ways that civilians and various sorts of warfighters are intertwined, and they come together at the level of state surveillance. Rosie, was that the question?
Well,
did I answer your question?
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? The stuff that making quick U-turns can alert something up on a satellite level to what you're doing. And it's interesting because we were talking about this a little bit in the talk before about resistance to surveillance and sort of hiding in there's somebody in the next talk at 6 that was accidentally put on a terrorist list in the US, and in order to kind of counter the constant intrusion into his privacy, put his entire life online to sort of show where he is at every point as an art project. Sydney, have you got have you investigated ways to disrupt these technologies in the way that, say, Hassan Elahi or Leo Savaggio have done so?
Yeah. Well, first, Hassan and Leo are both phenomenal, and if you can, you should absolutely go to their talks. I'm a fan of both of them. There is a profound choreographic question here, because the kinds of surveillance systems that are doing this watching, this always-on watching, they're also always learning. So this is a machine learning kind of question here too, because if we choreograph an approach to evade certain kinds of surveillance patterns or to evade the kinds of repertories or gestures that we know the surveillance system is looking for, those kinds of choreographies only work once, maybe twice, before the system is able to learn from them. So what this maybe requires, if you're so inclined to attempt to evade or sort of dazzle these surveillance systems, is a kind of perpetual making, a kind of perpetual dance making, a perpetual choreography of resistance that is always cognizant, not only of being watched, but of the system that is watching always learning.
Wow. Okay, so we're kind of going into the realms of what I would have considered, until I researched this, sort of science fiction, aren't we? So you almost need an AI. You need to be AI in order to counter another AI element.
It doesn't hurt to have access to an AI or two, maybe. But also, I mean, echoing earlier remarks here, there is also something profoundly human about operating unpredictably. being chaotic, being messy, being sloppy. These are all characteristics that can contribute to evading these systems. It doesn't always work, but also AIs aren't perfect. AIs are good at certain kinds of patterns, but very bad at others. There's a lot of, again, I think this is maybe a moment where dance and improvisation, choreography can be really useful proving grounds to see how artificially intelligent systems do or can't respond to bodies and bodies' motions through space and time.
And I mean, there's something about the framing, isn't it? It's not just the AI. It's how we use that data, and it's the humans that put the frame around what questions we're asking, I guess. I mean, Rob, you talked a bit to me about putting women on the front line has been quite a long process over the past sort of 10 to 12 years, and there's only been so many females that have managed to get into the infantry, or just recently, I just saw this week, pass special forces training. And there was always an argument, would they be strong enough and all the rest of it, but you discovered some things with your research, didn't you, about female fighters?
Well, I think it sort of harks back to an earlier point around what's the question that we're asking. Is the question to put a massive rucksack on and go up the hill as quickly as one can, or is it going to be actually what the operational output needs to be, which would be early identification, early reaction, and early sort of doing something about it. How quickly can one react? So I think one of the things we're trying to do is, I think there was some initial resistance from certain elements that were worried about what happens if the data says one thing, that a certain group is going to be much better at something than the other. It's the wrong way. Sort of the exact opposite way to look at this is why don't we actually work out what certain groups are good at, certain groups are not good at, and then work out how we can assess the mission. I mean, it's sort of, if one looks at some of the courses, I was in the Royal Marines, we go back to sort of the commanders of World War II, and that's fantastic, and some of the tests that are being done are brilliant, but that is a different sort of conflict to potentially what's operating now. The ability to go into, one thing Sydney said is look at a drone feed and work out whether car A is doing something odd or car B is doing something normal, and that's not necessarily going to be assessed by running across Dartmoor. So I think how one can sort of look at everybody across sort of society and then work out what specific skill sets, then actually sort of create roles potentially within them. We work primarily in the urban environment where you've got people that need to go through the door, people that need to then go into the room, sort of scan for a threat and then engage. Typically that's been three individuals doing the same role. Well, it's not beyond the sort of art of man that could be three different individuals. Someone that goes through the door and then someone that can go into a room quickly and sort of react and respond. So I think one of the things we've been trying to push at is looking at how different people respond to different threats and how people, there are different ways to do things. And I think there was an earlier point made about sort of 200 years of drill. I thought it was a fantastic point. That's what we are fighting against. There has been a certain way of doing things. And Sydney made a point a minute ago about how we're going to be scanning for certain behaviours. Well, the military is one giant predictable behaviour machine in terms of how it does things. When an infantry section patrols across open ground, they're sort of 10 to 15 metres spaced apart. Well, if that can get picked up pretty easily by a drone, so we just need to start to vary this dramatically and quickly. Otherwise, it's going to be quite easy to work. I had a discussion the other day where we were sort of working out if one can see a drone, for instance, that's being flown, that potentially the person flying it is within a certain sort of space on the ground. Well, we know exactly where people that we fight would typically be, wood blocks and tops of hills. So you're making it pretty easy to work out where they are, whereas be somewhere completely different, sort of really sort of push the boundaries of what you could or can be doing effectively, rather than doing what we've always done, which I think is going to be more difficult as AI starts to creep into the battlefield. So.
Yeah. Harry, I shared with you a document about the augmented soldier, which looked at everything. It was an MOD document that looked at everything from biometrics, like improving sleep and food and heart rate, all the way through to brain implants, and the ethical framework about that. What do you think about that, and particularly with your work related with your new book, and is it going to happen?
Well, yeah, I think often the sort of futurists, it sounds like it's just around the corner, and I was thinking it's probably a bit further away than we think. I think just interesting, when we were talking about AI just then, that often the people who construct the algorithms that create these AIs, some of the most sophisticated ones, we lose touch of how actually they're making the decisions, and that's quite a sort of disconcerting notion, really, that something that we've created, we no longer know how it's coming to the conclusions that it is. The AI that has started to sequence proteins, we don't know how it's done it. And I think that is disconcerting. So for instance, Elon Musk, his neural lace that he's trying to develop, which may be something that could be weaponized in the future. The idea that he talks about is that if we're going to have these super powerful AIs, the only way that we're going to be able to interface with them is through some sort of neural lace where we actually connect ourselves to the machine, essentially. And I mean, to me, the whole thing is horrifying, actually, because of that loss of humanity. But for other people, I've met scientists who would, if you gave them the choice, they would upload themselves into some sort of substrate hard drive if you gave them the chance just to see what it was like. And I just think the idea is sort of bonkers, because I think we are so embodied. Western society in particular has had this real notion of the or should I say philosophy, that a lot of it's about how the brain is like a computer. That's how we sort of understand it. Whereas actually, it's my sense of it, and this is purely subjective, but is that we're so much more connected to our bodies. And I think I'm not really answering a question. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I think so just coming back to this idea of sort of implantables, and it'd be interesting, Rob, if you thought about that in terms of how you can do some sort of biometric implantable and what that would mean for the soldier and ethics and all of that. I think there's huge amounts of.
But you talk about how I can't even wear earrings. They drive me absolutely bonkers. Like anything alien in or on the body will get fault. So it's not as simple as there isn't a robo soldier just about to kind of run out. It doesn't work like that. And like you say, people are kind of wowed and wooed by expensive technologies, but you're all kind of, it sounds like you're saying that it's the human.
Well, if you look at Atlas or something from Boston Dynamics, which is their, I think it's their version which stands up and it does a backflip, and there's some great YouTube. And I don't know for sure, but there's lots of outtakes of it falling over and things. And when you put something like that into the true chaos of the real world, and it's the same for my prosthetic. When I'm walking around in the rehab centre, everything's flat. There's lifts. As soon as you go out into the Princess Street or something, everything's slightly cambered. It's the chaos of people walking around, and the computer or the machine, should I say, is less effective, and it requires a lot more sort of cognitive load for me to work. So yeah, I think it's there's a long way to go on it, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to come to you guys for a question or two in a moment. I suppose my final question is to all of you, and is the future of soldiering in the mind or in the body?
Got stop. So, I'm going to sort of answer it by asking the question, I suppose, but I think, and then answering it by saying both. But I'd say in the short term, I actually am completely with Harry that I think technology is often viewed as around the corner. I think it's going to be a lot more of a sort of iterative process until we get to some of the areas we're talking about. So I'd argue soldiering is always going to be, or not always, but will be for a while, a physical activity. So to start with the body, however, a lot of where the army and the defence community is looking at now is how can we sort of augment that individual and sort of improve their performance. So how that is done, I think, is going to be very important. So I think how to monitor, how to sort of look at what information is needed. Some stuff Sydney's talked about, gestures, I think is going to be incredibly important as we move forward in terms of assuming. I watched a TED talk he gave where he was talking about sort of some gestures can mean two things, and there was an amazing talk I was recently about sort of assessing firefights, a drone being able to look at a firefight. Well, a firefight is a group of individuals lying on the ground firing guns. The problem is there are two sides doing that exact thing, and how you can differentiate between side A and side B. So to come back to the question, I'd say it's going to be, to me, the body in the short to medium term. I think the mind is going to start to come in the medium to long term. But it's very important that we use the sort of next few years to sort of capture the data sort of really understand what is going on before we start to look at some of the Boston dynamics like robotics, and as that creeps in, what do we want them to do, and can they do the thing better than a human's going to be able to do? And that's a fundamental question that technology should always find a need. I do find in the defence community sometimes a need is forced to find technology, which is the exact opposite. So I think working out where the body is best suited and where the mind is best suited is going to be quite critical. So I'm completely on the fence to answer.
Thank you. Over to Sydney.
Yeah, I'm going to offer a similar yes and both sides kind of answer, perhaps. I think undoubtedly the future of soldiering is grounded in the body. I take your earlier point about Elon Musk and the transhuman kind of upload your brain into some kind of Johnny Mnemonic style dolphin computer or whatever, and those sorts of fictions are so bonkers and so ableist and so violent and so racist and so dumb. Of course, billionaires are propagating them. In any event, to be grounded in the body is to, again, going back to earlier points, we have to put the body first. In soldiering, as in civilian life, it is so easy to postpone consideration of the body. One of the reasons why I am insistent on dance and choreography as ways of addressing some of these questions is because choreography specifically puts bodies first. But to maybe extend the logic a little bit, maybe the future of soldiering is in the body, but I think the future of warfare is in the mind. I think about the arguably 4, 5, 6 active simmering cold wars that are happening at this given moment, and how various forms of disinformation and propaganda are in the service of those cold wars. These things relate, of course, but here's the both and. I don't know that we can separate the embodied future of soldiering from the rational forms of propaganda and disinformation that we're seeing today.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Harry, any?
I'm not sure I could add much. I was just thinking. I mean, I think for me, I sort of agree with both what Rob and Sydney have said. But I do think that at the end, the way we fight wars might gravitate towards the mind. But I still think at the end of the day, if you're going to defeat the will of your opposition, it's about sadly, it's about doing violence to the body. And I also think we talked at the very start about the Greek soldiers, and I don't think we should necessarily underestimate how much of warfare was in the mind for them too. I know we have all these technologies which completely, in a transformational way, change the way we interact with each other. But it's interesting to sometimes think back, and maybe it hasn't changed as much as we think. It's just the way we communicate and our bodies interact has changed a bit. I'm not sure I've made any sense. But.
Well, I suppose I feel like I want to put on a final comment, which is that it was always my sort of thing with Five Soldiers, was that the soldiers don't send themselves to war. The politicians do in democratic countries. Or other people in power make those decisions, and in a democratic country we vote for those politicians, so we have a say in that, or we should have a say in that, and we do in terms of voting people in or out, not necessarily in protesting. And then after soldiers are trained and fight and then end being a soldier, there is a lot better process than there used to be, but there isn't necessarily any kind of process to really bring them back into civilization, or into civil society rather. And that again is our duty as civilians to realise what they have done has been quite an extreme experience, and we need to make sure that we understand their needs as they come back in. Hence, you'll have seen the very high rate of suicide 10 years, 12 years on from some of those really big battles in Afghanistan. So the injuries in terms of moral injury can be very long-lasting as opposed to physical injuries. So there's always that question, we have a say in the why. We're not powerless in this as voters, as civilians. So over to you guys. We haven't got ages, but I've got a good 5 minutes for some questions from the floor, please. Anybody? Oh, I've got one at the back, first of all. And could you speak quite loudly, and then I will try and repeat your question for the online audience.
I was Bello.
Thank you.
So interesting talk. I thought, well, you guys did mention it kind of towards the end, so forgive me for making a real hash of your ideas, but it's really interesting how you divided the mind and the body towards the end. Like, is it in the mind, is it in the body? I think it's quite an old question of like, I think or I am, like body, mind, separation, and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting. It's quite interesting how you didn't mention tech in that question, because I think that particularly now, like during COVID, I think that the deeper one's connection to like digital spaces, maybe there's a less reliance on physical mobility in spaces, and how that can really help, people with disabilities or barriers to access, people who are in America, for example, that can really like bring together different barriers. And arguably, our phones are now an extension of our bodies. It's pretty much wearable tech. You don't even need to have these implanted in you if you're using it all the time. But it's interesting that you did mention tech, because I think that's the more dependent that we are on it. Doesn't it arguably maybe deaden our accountability for those actions? You kind of mentioned it very, very briefly towards the end about remote drone strikes, about how the way that you attack now can be done through pushing a button. You don't necessarily need the body. But arguably with dance and the way that Army train and the way they work together is through group thinking and sharing ideas, and how that, you exist in relation to the other in terms of other people's bodies. That doesn't make sense, but like, and so I wonder whether you have something to say about that in terms of the way that like the Army and the way that dance, the way they work together is very reciprocal, but the way that we are existing now is very kind of parasocial. You don't necessarily need a kind of physical body or physical space in order for us to continue where we are, particularly in 2021. It's a very long question, there's a lot of stuff that's not wrapping out, but I think I just kind of need to get it all down because there are so many ideas at play.
I think that's a great question, and I'll do just a little plug and say, that there's also this tech kind of question going on right through all the conversations we're having, and I hope the feeling is by the end of tomorrow that we'll have explored so many sort of like, we're going to dive into this, and we're going to have a look at this, and we're going to dive into that, and then we're going to add it all up together, hopefully at the end. We'll see. But to paraphrase your question really, really massively, which was that my end question was, is it the body or the mind? And you're saying, yes, but what about tech? Tech has changed the way that we are physically relating to one another. How do we respond? You had the question.
One of the things I'm just going to pick part of your question, if that's all right. And I think one of the things I really liked was you mentioned sort of, as a result of the last year, sort of how society, both arts and defence, has sort of had to adapt how it sort of works. From going from a very social, everyone in one place, to a much more sort of disparate environment. And one of the things that we're looking at doing is the military has got a very big tilt towards collective training, where you get hundreds or thousands of soldiers into an area to then train maybe down in sort of Salisbury or their training areas up in the north. One of the things we're sort of pushing now, which I think is a real opportunity, is to have smaller groups synthetically relocated. So you have the military, for good reasons and bad, are spread all over the United Kingdom. But how can you overcome that geographic dislocation with synthetic relocation? By sort of stitching smaller training facilities dotted around the country into one larger one. And there are definitely sort of crossovers with the arts there, effectively, where I massacred it earlier when you asked me to discuss sort of virtually how we look at it. Is instead of looking at it through a virtual reality headset, we look at training as effectively, you have what's going on in the physical environment, what's going on in the synthetic environment, how they overlap, where those touch points are. So how you can stitch, say, 10 buildings around the country into one synthetic village and then allow loads of people to train together, I think something that the last year has actually forced the discussion on, which is fantastic. It's probably achieved 10 years of development in 6 to 12 months of mandatory sort of isolation, effectively.
Let's move on to the next question. Okay, white shirt, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of an extension from what Ellen was saying, which is, I guess when you spend more money now that's online instead of actually having physically in person, you spend a lot more than you would with about it, but it's something physical and tangible. You're actually more conscious of what you're doing. And I guess my first question before was, is there a lot of money being spent on actually integrating back in society for a lot of there's a lot of PTSD with the trauma of experiences, but I guess I've actually realised from discussion that it's kind of what you're doing is in a way affecting that, because when you're actually doing something that is, like I was saying, more tech and it's more impressing buttons and things like that, you're actually having a less human experience of like, oh, that's a human being now affecting now. So yeah, I guess my question from that is it just a way of kind of improving PTSD for people around the tech, because it takes away that oh, I'm actually impacting someone, it kind of separates you.
So I just think one thing I was thinking about is, especially with the question before, was, and it links to this, was I think sometimes we, and I was in a few firefights in my time, but the things that I actually, and so it's very immediate, I was pulling the trigger, and we often think that those are and seeing friends who've been badly hurt, you often sort of think that those are the moments that are going to sort of haunt you, but actually the moments that haunt me is when I was back in the operations room, and I was the one plugged in, and I could hear people in another location, they were elsewhere, and I could see their sort of, it was pretty rudimentary, but I could see where they were on a digital map. And hearing them being hurt or injured and making decisions about that were actually the moments that sort of haunt me most. And I think we've sort of, there's some record of that in sort of people who fly drones and things like that. So I'm not answering your question about PTSD, but I think you're right. There are ways of connecting people with technology to make them, overcome things like PTSD. And I'm not an expert on it, but I suspect maybe that answers half the question.
And tomorrow I've got some people that work in drone technologies, and one thing that I talked about is trigger trauma. So on the one hand, you have this kind of dehumanizing aspect of the technology that's pulling people further and further away from the trigger point, whether it be like close sort of, warfare to 3-mile sniper to 3,000 miles away in a drone center in Arizona. Actually, the people pulling the triggers still can get trigger trauma. But for me, there's always that thing of the trigger's still hitting a human being wherever you are, how close or how far you are. That nature of warfare stays consistent.
I think Sydney's probably the better person to speak about it, given what he knows about sort of the drone aspect. But I've always found that the further away you are, the worse it is. So actually, I think the narrative is sometimes the wrong way around. Yeah. That I think when it was a close-up firefight where you're pulling a trigger and they're pulling a trigger,
you can reconcile it.
Yeah, and there's an element of fairness as well. I always thought that they have as much of a chance as I do. Was when there's a drone strike like from 3,000 miles away. There's a lot. It's harder to reconcile, but also there is an element of there's a loss of parity there, which I think potentially in a city where you've got.
Yes. No, I couldn't, forgive me, I couldn't quite hear the question, but it strikes me in hearing my fellow discussants talk about this, that, the trigger is a metaphor. Triggers are an interface. Functionally, what we're doing when we are pressing a button to tell a drone to fire a missile or shooting a gun, we are making an embodied decision to cause harm. And your brain doesn't care so much whether the interface is a trigger or a space bar on your computer. What your brain understands is the way that your body is interfacing with the technology onto harm. And I'm not an expert in trauma by any measure, but from an embodied perspective, again, irregardless of the technology in the middle, irregardless of how it's mediated, functionally, the body remembers the trauma, whether it's, a keyboard or a trigger. These things are metaphors, and the body doesn't much care for metaphors.
Well, I know that we have another show coming in this afternoon, so I just want to say a huge thank you. There is another talk at 6 o'clock with Ken Sukia, the senior editor of The Economist, James Ario, our director of the Ditchley Foundation, and the artist that we mentioned, Professor Hassan Elahi, who was accidentally put on the terrorist list. We're talking about surveillance and data, who's watching whom, and what's the role of the artist post-pandemic. Ken wrote the book about big data and has also written a book about framing. So if you're interested in technologies, that might be quite an interesting. Oh, and they're all online, so it'll only be me live. So you might want to watch it online. And there's also 4 talks tomorrow that you can see on the website, both in real life and online. But thank you to Harry so much, thank you to Rob, and thank you to Sydney, and thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. Cheers.